Whiskey is any distilled spirit that's made from grain.
When you hear Texas whiskey, it sounds like something that's been made for the last 200 years. Not something that's just come across in the past decade, roughly.
Not a lot of other states in the country really have that, like a real identity around what it means to produce whiskey there.
If there's a uniform characteristic that applies to all of it, is that it's easier to age bourbon in Texas than it is in probably most states in America because of the heat.
And so that Texas weather that we were just talking about is so important to that narrative because it is actually creating a unique spirit that has a unique story behind it.
But as you look at Texas whiskey, I think a lot of what has made it special too is the entrepreneurial spirit behind it.
Good bourbon can change the world. Good bourbon creates enduring, lasting friendships. And good bourbon creates legendary stories. That's our philosophy.
Most may think of whiskey as something only made in Kentucky. But in Central Texas, a relatively new style of whiskey is being distilled.
You know, I've loved good bourbon whiskey since I was 13 years old.
A style that Dan Garrison knows well. 15 years ago, he opened Garrison Brothers.
We believe we were the first whiskey distillery built in America outside of Kentucky. We're pretty confident that that's the case.
For Garrison Brothers whiskey and all other Texas whiskey, everything starts with the grain, which after being cooked together ferments in these open containers.
These 500-gallon fermenters are fed to our 500-gallon stills.
Donis Todd is the master distiller here.
Everything that I show you, from the raw grains to our specific weather here in high Texas, you know, that all shines through in that bottle.
Unlike some whiskeys, Texas whiskey is a relatively open style.
This barrel's going to hold about 120 pounds of white dog.
Each distiller makes their own choice, but it's the aging where Texas plays a role.
There's no uniform trait or characteristic that applies to all Texas whiskeys that are made today. If there's a characteristic that is true amongst all of the distillers that make whiskey in Texas, it's just hothouse aging, you know, where we're aging these barrels in the heat, and that has a pronounced effect on the flavor.
A lot of it is the same in what Texas is versus the Texas whiskey. The first thing people talk about is the harshness, the heat of the summers, and what that does, if you can imagine whiskey in a barrel, it's almost like a sponge effect of it getting to come in and out.
Daniel Barnes owns and runs Treaty Oak Distilling. He's seen the growth in the community, the change in how different distillers interact.
You know, Texas has been one of the very first, outside of Kentucky, one of the very first whiskey regions to really get more of a national attention placed on it. And you're seeing the Central Texas corridor, this heart of Texas, if you will, become one of the primary whiskey regions in the United States. Like, we were, whenever I first started Treaty Oak, there was a very competitive scene between Texas distillers. And I would say, if anything now, it's a much more collaborative scene.
Allowing newer brands to join the community, keeping the future flowing.
I think what's going to be so fun is to watch the next decade, the next 2 decades of what Texas whiskey does.
For Texas whiskey in general, this is like just the beginning. I think you talk to all the distillers here in Texas and they're just starting to feel what's coming.
Brandon Joldersma is the general manager at Still Austin, a distillery that's newer to the scene, but sees a place to grow.
The really great thing about Texas whiskey is we have this, you know, kind of commonality around innovation, around, you know, the weather like we've been talking about. But also there's so much room for kind of unique personalities and brand identities in the whole thing. There's been a lot of great distilleries that have popped up in the meantime, and there's so much innovation, so much interesting stuff happening, and we have a real claim, I think, to the geography here being interesting and unique. And we really believe that, you know, over the next few years, Texas will really start to get recognized as its own meaningful place for whiskey.
A meaningful place for whiskey. A place to create our own style and do things our way.
There's a rebellious nature to do things differently from the way they've been done in the past.
Our heat and all that extraction really makes a real unique mouthfeel.
From My favorite thing about bourbon is the community around it, like how much it really brings people together. Like
consumers start to understand and look at Texas whiskey as a true genre of whiskey to go approach and try.
And use it to celebrate just making it home that day, or the birth of a new child, or an anniversary.
In Central Texas, I'm Hank Cavagnaro.